So if we were to progress this all the way, in my opinion, an all the way progression of a goblet squat would be an overhead squat with a pause, right? Or a timed eccentric concentric, or a Zercher squat. Those are the two hardest squat variables in my opinion, right? So they require the most of your joints, they require the most mobility, they require the most flexibility and stability cumulatively to do them well. So if we add from the goblet squat, if we progress then to a single arm kettlebell front rack squat, and then we progress to a double kettlebell front rack squat, and then we progress to a barbell front squat, and then we progress to a back squat, and then we progress to a pause back squat, and then we progress to a different bar squat, like a safety bar squat, and then we maybe progress to an overhead squat if they have the capability to hold the bar overhead. The only thing we've ever changed is load. Just the load position, right? Once we get to the overhead squat, we're changing load position, we're changing distance of movement, we're changing foot placement. Almost everything changes, okay? Overhead squat, in my opinion, is a squat that should be done with like 0.01% of the population. So the variable system that I use is very quick and on demand in the session. In your mind, it should be. So if we look at something, see somebody's doing a push-up incorrectly, take away a variable or add a variable of range of motion, right? Elevate their hand. Elevate their hands, it immediately makes the push-up easier, doesn't compromise midline stability. I don't believe in dropping your knees because then it just becomes a tricep extension. So, and we lose what the push-up's real purpose is, which is midline stability. So in a push-up, we would be adding a variable of distance, right? And adding a variable of range of motion by changing the actual angle that our body is performing a movement, okay? So when we use this, it allows on-the-spot, quick decision-making without being lost for cues. So this system trained to your coaches of just saying, okay, let's take one variable away, rather than saying, what's going on with his hip, right? Well, his hip is doing this and it makes his squat look ugly, right? I don't really know what's going on with his hip, I just know that his squat looks weird. If we just walk up and we say, take a variable away, what variable do you want that to be, right? He can't hit depth. Perfect. So what's the variable we're going to take away? Distance. We're just going to have him squat until he can, and then work from there. Let's say they're doing a deadlift and they lose spinal neutrality or rigidity in their spinal column. Once they pass their knee, then we start teaching them the deadlift from right here. And then we progress downward, increasing the variable of distance, which is just one variable at a time, right? Where things get lost is when you add multiple variables at the same time, okay? Your clients, my clients, Kale's clients when he had a gym, everybody's, with movement, they're preschoolers, all of them, right? So you don't teach a preschooler how to count to 100 by tens, right? You teach them how to count to 10 by ones. Like let's say we're doing a pull-up at a CrossFit gym, right? A strict pull-up, you add one variable of a tempo on a pull-up, they could do that for a year. And it's gonna completely change their pull-up dynamic, right? Get your chin all the way over the bar, I want you to pause for 2 seconds. Their rep count's gonna drop by 70%, like that, right? So without increasing difficulty of the movement on the body, we're increasing difficulty of the movement with the strength, right? Making the movement better. Does that make sense to you guys? I always recommend taking away something that is indicating of the body first, not external, right? Let's say it's the goblet squat again. If we're doing something with the goblet squat, this is for mental training more so than the actual act of a squat for me with the client. But if we're doing a goblet squat and they're showing that, you know, their chest collapses in the squat, they can't really get into a good position, it looks as if the weight's pulling them down. If 8 kilos is pulling you down, you shouldn't even be in a gym, you should be in a PT office. right? It's not the kettlebell. Usually if we take this away, it just shatters their self-esteem. Like they're like, I can't even squat 8 kilos, right? They all think it's 8 pounds, but it's 8 kilos. So instead of doing like, keep your chest up, to a normal person that's this, which doesn't help either, right? So what if we just give them a target, right? Tell them to close their eyes and reach for a toilet in the dark. Everybody knows how to do that. Right? Everybody has to use the restroom at least once in their lifetime in the middle of the night with no lights. Quite simply, if they're in the bottom and they're here and you tell them like lift your chest up, if they knew how to do that, they wouldn't be doing this, right? So we have to teach them like sit back, keep your chest tall. The minute you feel yourself falling forward, we're not sitting back far enough for the squat. It's a pretty steadfast way to make sure that nobody gets hurt, is to be able to regress on the spot, walk through a class of 30 and say, you stop doing this, you do this harder, right? Add this variable, make it harder. And your clients will appreciate you either way, if you regress or progress them. RPE, rate of perceived exertion, or RIR, which is just reps in reserve. The value of the RPE and the RIR system come through most. I think that they shine best on deload days and max effort days. For day-to-day training, it's kind of a pain in the ass. So for me, it's just another stat to take notes on. I'm like, what was that RPE, like 5? I don't know, is that a 6? I don't know what a 6 even is. Maybe it was a 7.5, right? So when I was competing, I would train off of reps in reserve. It's pretty much the same as RPE, it's just a different verbiage. So a reps in reserve, I'd say leave 3 reps in reserve, which would equate to a 7 RPE. 7 out of 10, right? So I have 4 questions that were really asked in this. Is what is the benefit of using RPE or RIR? What is real effort? That was my question that I wrote for you guys. What is real effort? And what is perceived effort, and what is emptying your tank? Which is my famous tagline for the 1-minute calorie bike challenge. Maybe we should do that tomorrow morning as a group and everybody can PR.
What time?
4:45 in the morning. People have a really bad RPE scale. So RPE scale I posted a picture of in the group like 2 weeks ago or so, 3 weeks ago. I talked about it this morning with Maggie. She had a 20 rep max safety bar squat. Just no big deal. It's the worst thing in the world. So she was doing reps 17, 18, 19, 20. It was relatively easy, right? And she was like, what should I be shooting for on like difficulty level here? And I was like, you should not be able to do 21, right? It's a 20 rep max. So like rep 20, you should be like, it should look like you have Parkinson's and you're coming up like shaking, right? So from where she thought she was at her 20 rep max to where I put her at her 20 rep max was 48 pounds difference. Okay? And she did it fine on her own. And then I said, you can add more. And she'd squat 1 and she was like, nah. So, but that's a big difference. So that's my IRPE on people, like what I see, which is why I ask you guys to video things, right? Versus what you think is hard. Reps in reserve, like I said, is my favorite. It's really easy for me to judge if my coach tells me to do max effort pull-ups and leave 3 reps in the tank, right? The reason that he says that is because he doesn't really know how many pull-ups I can do in one sitting. Because most coaches will never have you do like 1 set of pull-ups for max reps every 4 weeks to see where we improve. It's just kind of arbitrary, right? So the goal would be for that 3 rep set of leaving 3 reps in reserve to increase. So let's say 1 week it's 15, the next week we may want 16, 17, the next week we may want eventually to get to 20, and then in my head, 20, I have a new milestone. So if I'm hitting 20 pull-ups, I'm now doing weighted pull-ups for half of that volume or a quarter of that volume, right? So reps in reserve is a way to train to failure without failing. So what is real effort? when your body or when your mind is at the point where it's saying stop, your body's only at about 40%. Which is a real wake-up call for a lot of people, right? I usually look at the 1 minute calorie challenge on your assessments, and in my head, I'm like, what the fuck? Like the initial assessment, I'm like, really? That's it? 13 calories in a minute, right? So there's a couple reasons that I put that one singular test in the assessment. Most of it is mental fortitude. That's really all I'm seeing. How hard can I push you before you actually just give up, right? Or if I say, pick a heavy weight, are you gonna pick a 20 or a 45, right? So, or is your fear of injury greater than your fear of growth? Which in most people, that's what it is. So if we're talking anaerobic real effort, if I'm talking 100% effort on anaerobic activities, you should not be able to function for about an hour after 1 minute of work. The 5 minute max cal, it was a challenge on the Schwinn website when Schwinn used to make the Airdyne, back when it was gold. I think it was 1993 or something. The website had these challenges up from like 2007 to 2012 about the milestones that people could hit on the Airdyne, which is the bike that the Assault bike and the Echo bike are modeled after. The Schwinn Airdynes now are trash compared to how they used to be, but you had an old school Airdyne, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So their standard is 5 miles in 10 minutes or 3 miles in 5 minutes. Wretched. Wretched. I tried the 10-minute one like 33 times before I got it. And then I had a triathlete come in and do it with ease the next day. It was just like, and he wasn't out of breath. Those baseline tests are there for a reason, right? Very little of that reason is to see what you're capable of physically. Almost none of it, right? Most of it's mental, most of it's to see what score you get and then what notes you leave me. So what is perceived effort? Perceived effort is difficult. It's if you can self-judge what is 10%, what is 50%, what is 70%, what is 100%, right? So if we look at the scale of RPE on what 100% is, 100% on something like a squat, for instance, given a rep load. Like if I said I want a 10 RPE on a 5 rep squat, it's likely going to be a 5 rep max or a new weight or a PR on a 5 rep max, right? So if I tell you that I want you to do a 4 RPE or a 5 RPE, then it's likely going to be a deload week, right? This is where RPE for me shines, is on deload weeks, like I said, right? So if you take 50% effort, here's the really simple way to do it. 50% of your max, right? It's an easy way to do that. Now, hypothetically, if we're 12 weeks in or 10 weeks into a strength cycle, then your 50% should now be about 40% or 35%, right? So hypothetically, if you're like, oh, that was 50% and I did 5, that kind of felt like a 2 RPE. That was really, really easy. Then you can increase weight from there conservatively. Emptying your tank. I said, what is emptying your tank? Which is what I just said on the bike, right? Emptying your tank in lifting is where people freak out because they think they're going to get hurt, okay? Emptying your tank on a deadlift like this is fine. Emptying your tank on a deadlift to the point where they're like, not fine, right? Technique overload at all times, right? So empty your tank within reasonable measure. Very few people do I look at a rep max and I'm like, oh, you should stop and not do that ever again, right? Most of the time people don't really push themselves, most of the time because they're afraid of getting hurt. If you're that afraid of getting hurt, you should probably talk to me about that, right? So, or it's a lack of confidence. In women, I see a lot of lack of confidence in bench pressing motions. especially if they don't have a spotter, right? Which I don't blame you. In guys, I see a lot of lack of confidence or a lot of lack of push in squatting patterns. I don't know why. I think it's probably because they think they're going to hurt their back. I would assume. You guys are not that fragile, first. Second, if that's the mindset that we're walking into training with, we have to shift that mindset. If you're like walking into every training session like, oh fuck, I may get hurt on this bench today, right? My shoulder hurts and it's probably going to hurt more. It's probably going to hurt more afterwards, right? So like this whole gigantic explosion in my shoulder happened as I was lifting, and I was like, oh, something doesn't really feel right, but I'm going to keep benching. And then boom, right? I could almost see it happening before it happened in my warm-up sets, right? But I just didn't really listen. That's the opposite of what I want you to do, right? I never get onto a bench or on a bar and I'm like, oh fuck, this is gonna be scary. Let's hope I don't get hurt, right? And squat, right? Or I've got this insane spinal injury that nobody ever experiences, which is real. I hope it doesn't flare up right now, right? I act as if I'm well prepped, right? I take care of myself well. I warm up well. I treat my body well. I walk into training sessions like I'm bulletproof and usually walk out and realize I'm not, right? My rule of thumb when it comes to pushing yourself to that, to emptying your tank, if it's a singular movement, if it doesn't feel right that day, you probably should listen to your body.
So my question, I do have a question in regards to
What's up?
effort.
Yeah.
So whether it's a 3-rep max or a 5-rep max or a 1-rep max, the way I've always been taught is to build up to that max, you just do one, whatever it is. Is that how you do it?
If it's anything over a 3-rep max, I would do a little bit more repetitions in your warm-up sets. By the laws of percentages, technically your 5-rep max should be around 87 to 91%. 8 times out of 10, that's wrong. But you can use that as an estimate of like, this is 50% of my max, I'm going to do this for a set of 5. This is 70% of my max, I'm going to do this for a set of 3. If you prime your body with singles, then it's going to just want to do singles, right? So if you're doing a 5-rep max, I would at least do 2 sets of 5 at a respective load. And then I would drop to 3s or 2s, and then I would go for a 5. So when it comes to prep work based on assessment stuff, in person, 100% based on function and movement. Online, 100% based on the opposite, right? That's why I wanted to do something like this. That's because really it was Wilson's idea. I have to give him more of the credit because he was like, I just came for an assessment for an hour and we did things for like 5 minutes and now everything's fixed. Why don't you do this for everybody in KO, right? Most people's problems are a lot more simple than they think. So, and usually if you have a hip problem, it has nothing to do with your hip. So, online, what I'm looking at for your assessment, like day 1 front squat. Right. The reason that we front squat and not back squat, it's likely that most people will back squat a 10-rep max and think they got hurt when really their body's like, oh, I haven't lifted weights in a long time. Like this, right? A front squat shows me a lot about how well you move, more so than anything. It shows me if you can get into a rack position. It shows me if you can get to depth in a squat, if you can get to below depth in a squat, what happens to your thoracic extension when you're in a squat position, how hard do you push yourself in the squat. I kid you not, 95% of people in KO's 10-rep max, their 10th rep looks like this. I'm like, rep max. After front squats, I usually do pull-ups, right? Is that day 1? Yeah, something like that. And then farmer carry. Usually always a farmer carry. Farmer carry, in my opinion, is cardio. There's really nothing that takes the place of carrying heavy stuff, right? It's very multifunctional. Farmer carries is your core, right? That's ab work. I have to explain that to my gen pop here all the time. Like, when are we gonna do direct ab work? I'm like, never. Where you do it in every movement that you do, right? So the farmer carry for me is a good test of just, first off, grip strength. Because the first thing to fatigue in a farmer carry is always gonna be your forearm, right? Second off, it's to see if you're strong enough to carry your body weight. If you can't carry your body weight, we've got some work to do, right? Day 2 is when we do, some people do power cleans, some people do deadlifts, some people do clean pulls. Most of the time I say we're gonna do power cleans and people are like, that scares me, I'm not gonna do that, right? Or I don't do power cleans, or they're gonna cause me pain, or what did I have you do? Broad jump, right? So really the only thing that I'm testing in the power clean is hip extension. I could care less what you lift, right? So I just wanna see if you do a power clean like this, right? Or if you actually understand the mechanic of getting into hip extension, right? A broad jump is the simplest form of hip extension. Kettlebell swing would be second, right? So that's just a test to see training fluency with a body movement, which is just full hip extension. From there, we do a mile run. Most of the time, I just want to see if you guys will do it, right? Secondly, I want to see if you'll do it and if you'll actually try hard. So the mile run, honestly, is kind of like the 1 minute bike. I want to see how hard you'll actually push yourself, if you'll do it. Sometimes people don't do it. And then lastly, it's a really good indicator for me of like, no, I can't run because it hurts this or it hurts that, right? Which most of the time your pain from running is not wrong, but it gives me a really good input into what's actually going on with your body, right? Last day we do hex bar deadlift or deadlift because it's just the greatest lift of all time. That's it. That's it. Really, the deadlift is just the purest form of strength testing, in my opinion. I also want to see what control you have of your spine, what type of fluency you have with the movement, how well you perform it, how hard you push yourself, and how strong or weak you are. The deadlift is really kind of the best test for that. And then I do that little stupid little like Metcon WOD type thing of 5, 10, 15 reps of box jumps, bodyweight squats, and med ball slams, right? I have a standard on those times on what a woman should be able to do in a certain shape, meaning what shape she's in, and then second, what a guy should be able to do, and most people don't hit that standard, but it's a good indicator for me as well of, first off, how well or how poorly you move once you fatigue. Because a bodyweight squat can turn into a real shit show real quick, right? Once you start getting exhausted. Even a med ball slam can turn into like this really good motion of here down to like, you look like a zombie, right? We had a lot of questions of how I pick what we do next based on the assessment. My general answer is whatever your goals are, right? So all of you guys have very different goals in here, working with me. So that's like 75% of what I'm doing in your programming is dictated by your goal. If you can absolve somebody's pain through movement, they are married to you. Married to you. So if you can say, if somebody comes to you and says, I'm not going to squat, it always hurts when I squat, and you say, can I offer you a solution to that, right? And then we use that solution that's not squatting to start, because that's obviously a fear point, right? If we say, okay, we won't squat, but how about this, right? And then in 6 weeks you get them to a squat and they forget that squats hurt. Or they're like, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, well, this is what we've done in the last 6 weeks. I confidently think you can squat. Do you think that I would put you in harm? No, let's try a squat. And they squat for the first time in 15 years and they're like, well, it didn't hurt at all. And you see them like light up and they're like, holy shit, you changed their life. You didn't just get them stronger. In my opinion, if a coach is married to a system, they should stop coaching. And they're no longer exploring other options or realizing that what they're doing could be wrong and being able to accept that, right? There's been many times when I've been like, oh shit, I shouldn't have done that for the last 2 years. I should change that. That's not really safe, right? Or I can approach this differently and way more efficiently, and I could have avoided those 2 injuries that happened in here 3 years ago if I just would have known this then. But the grass is always greener, right? Or in hindsight's 2020. If you stop evolving and you're married to a system, the thing with CrossFit is it's just the 2000s version of jazzercise. It's really trendy and people want to do that because that's what is trendy, right? It's culty. So the minute you change it, I can literally change a CrossFit program and do the exact same thing, except not structure it the way CrossFit's programmed, and the coaches are like, I can't do that. No way. This is like, there's no warm-up section, there's not a strength section, and then there's not a conditioning, like an AMRAP or a Metcon, right? And I'm like, it is a Metcon. You understand that metabolic conditioning was discovered and around since the 40s. You guys just name your conditioning Metcon, right? I'm doing the same thing, I just call it anaerobic training, right? So, and what I'm doing between this strength segment and this other strength segment is just giving people more strength, which at the end of the day, that's what they need. They don't just need to be beat up in Metcons and AMRAPs and shit to failure and how many things can you do in 12 minutes, right? In my opinion, once you make fitness a race is once you start introducing injuries. If you tell me to race somebody to 100 snatches in 5 minutes, I will break my form down to become more efficient, right? And I will likely injure myself in the process. If you tell me just to do 100 snatches in 5 minutes, it changes completely, right? If you just tell me to do 100 snatches well, it changes the dynamic completely, right? So, and 100 snatches well in 7.5 minutes yields 10 times the return than 100 snatches in 3:58 with shit form, right? So I think that belief breaking comes down to what is your motivator to follow CrossFit, right? Or what is your motivator? I don't even want to call it CrossFit because it's technically not specific to CrossFit, but what is your motivator to be married to that specific type of programming or that specific structure or these specific movements? I weightlifted competitively at a very high level for 9 years. It's really fucking unsafe. When you're not taught really, really well, it's really unsafe. So, and it's not the heavy lifts that will get you, it's the lifts that get you when you're breaking down from fatigue. That's when compensation patterns really start happening. If you ask people to think about what's going on in a snatch, which technically, biomechanically, there's 73 functions going on in the skeleton and musculoskeletal system in one lift. 73 things going on. And you're asking Joe Schmo from the street to learn that and do it well. And then do it 37 times while you're tired after you just squat. And you have a shoulder issue that you didn't tell me about. For me, it comes down to, are you following to follow, or are you wanting to be a coach? Because I've studied the shit out of CrossFit, and a lot of what they do is really good. It's really effective in certain ways. 98% of CrossFit gyms in this country are shit. 2% of them are phenomenal, right? 2% of them don't do structured like WODs like you would see on the main site, right? There's nothing wrong with CrossFit. There's just Just like there's nothing wrong with Zumba or there's nothing wrong with powerlifting. It's just the delivery of it. So I would see, or I would ask if they're married to a system or if they're married to their own growth as a coach. Because those are two opposing extremes.